Hey folks, today we're diving literally into the incredible world beneath the waves. We're talking about the art and science of underwater photography, how to master lighting and color in an ever changing environment, the creative techniques that make marine life come alive, and why this type of photography is such a powerful tool for ocean conservation. Right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We've spent hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most renowned photographers of our time, giving you access to knowledge and expertise you won't find anywhere else. As always, I'm your host, Kirsten Lutz, and if you enjoy free podcast and YouTube content, and overall dive master, Kate Jonker. Kate, how's it going?
Hello, good, thanks. Very well. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here, and I hope I can add some value and some interest to sharing some of my insight into underwater photography and the world beneath the waves.
Well, thank you so much for for coming on the show. I think this is a really fascinating subject, generally, because actually we've never really had an underwater photographer on the podcast. Um, so, how did you first get involved in underwater photography? Was it something that came through the love for diving, or did photography come first, or how did that work for you?
Well, actually, photography came first. And when I was a child, I was given a camera for my birthday. And I spent a lot of time out in nature. I'm very lucky growing up in South Africa. We have beautiful nature reserves and beaches here that we can walk and take photos in. And I had a camera and I just went into the nature and started taking pictures. And from there, my love of underwater, love of photography grew. And yeah, when I studied in England, I did a BTEC HND in business and finance, and one of the actual courses that I did included photography of all things. And I just fell even more in love with photography and spent a lot of time with my camera, and especially in nature and photographing textures. So I did a lot of black and white underwater photography. And then many years later, I decided I wanted to become a scuba diver and I wanted to explore the world beneath the waves and see what was down there. Underwater had always been something that fascinated me, even from a young child. I used to love looking at books and pictures of nature, and especially fish and sharks and dolphins and whales and things like that. So when I got older and I grew up a bit, age of 30, I decided I was going to learn to scuba dive. And I didn't take a camera underwater with me for probably about 8 years. And then in 2008, I bought myself a camera because I wanted to photograph what I was seeing underwater and share that with other people. So photography came first, then scuba diving, and then eventually I did get back into photography again. But it wasn't an easy thing to master. Underwater photography is very different to photography on land.
Well, that's exactly my next question. To me, I mean, I'm maybe a little bit of a gear nerd, so I'm intrinsically interested in the gear that's required. But at the base of it, you're shooting with basically a regular mirrorless camera. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So I use mirrorless camera. I use I've got two, the Canon R5 and the R7. And you have to buy housing, so you have to keep that camera dry. It can't get wet underwater. Underwater photography is very equipment, re- what would you say, demanding on the amount of equipment that you need. Equipment intense. So yeah, it's more than just a camera. It's a lot of other things that you need for underwater photography too.
Because nothing is really built for that environment. Although mirrorless cameras nowadays, especially slightly more professional models like the R5 or Canon's it's Canon, Nikon's like Z8, for instance. They all they're weather resistant, but they're not really waterproof, so you need to protect, and the same thing is true for anything, I'm guessing, lighting, flashes, all the rest of it. None of these things are actually made to be used in that environment. So how do you get around it? You mentioned, um, camera housing, for example. How does any of that work? Because I really have no idea.
Okay, so first of all, you need to keep your camera very, very dry. Obviously, it can't get wet at all. So you have to invest in what's called an underwater camera housing. And they're made in different types of material. You can buy them made from polycarbonate, or you can make them that are made out of a solid block of aluminium. And that's then carved away to create a housing to put your camera in. So basically, what you need is you need the housing, but not only do you need the housing, you need a port. So I've got a port here, you can see. I know it's audio, but there's a port. Um, you have a port that screws into the front of the housing. And for every lens that you have on your camera, you need a different size port. So if you have a macro lens on your camera, you have to have a macro port that fits over your macro lens. And if you have a wide angle lens, you have to have a dome port to put on the front of your housing. So together with the housing and your port, they seal together. You have things called O-rings, which help to seal the housing and the port together. And all of that works together to keep your camera dry underwater. And then the housing has different buttons and different dials that help you change your settings on the camera underwater.
Well, that was actually exactly gonna be my next question. How do you control your camera when you're underwater? Does it mean, um, does it mean you need different housing for each, camera model that you use? Or is there a generic way that you can control how do you control your camera underwater?
Yes. So you actually, for every different camera you get, you need a different housing. You can use the same ports for the same manufacturer's housing. So, for example, I have a Marelux housing, so I have Marelux ports. So, if I got, well, for example, I have a Canon R5 and an R7, and I need different housing for both those cameras because on the housing are buttons, and those buttons line up with the buttons on your camera. And there are dials which line up with the dials on your camera. So because different cameras have different buttons or they have buttons in different places, you have to have a different housing for basically every different camera that you have. So I have two different housings, one for my R5 and one for my R7, but luckily my ports fit on the different housings. So I can use the same ports, but I do need to have different housings for my cameras.
Well, so here's a question that's a little bit left field, but I know that a lot of people who are listening, a lot of listeners and viewers might get into or might already be into mobile photography, for example. Um, is something like an iPhone, is that technology? Is that something that's making an inroad into underwater photography? Since these things are now virtually bulletproof.
Yeah, I've seen some good video footage and good photos that have been made with cameras in underwater housings, and it is opening up the world for many people to dive in and start taking photos underwater. So it's definitely one of the first steps into underwater photography. But then you might find if people love it so much, might want to expand into mirrorless underwater photography as they progressed, which is what I find also with people who start off with compacts, then go into mirrorlesses or DSLRs after that.
Many years ago, I mean, I'm literally this like how long ago? It's 30 years, nearly 30 years ago, 25 years ago, something like that. I did what was called an open water certificate. So I did like a diving course, but yeah, I've forgotten everything. Um, and I remember, I want to say the maximum, I literally forgotten everything. I think the maximum depth that I could go is about 12 meters. Is that right? Does that sound right? Um, how deep can you dive with your camera in a housing like that? Is there a limit? How does any of that work?
Well, first of all, it depends on your qualification because obviously to scuba dive, you need to be certified. So there's two different levels. You can do your open water, which could go down to 18 meters,
Oh, 18.
and then you do your advanced or your deep diving specialty, and then you can go down to about 40, depending on your qualification and certification that you have. Cameras or housings are made to go down to more than that. So with a normal housing for a DSLR or mirrorless, you can go down to about 40 to 60 meters, even more, depending on the housing. I'm not quite sure about cell phone or mobile phone housings, how deep you can take them. To be honest, I haven't even looked. But I can't imagine you would want to take one down to 40 meters, because if you look at them, they actually have, the ones that I've seen have a soft cover that enables you to still press the buttons or swipe on the screen. So I don't think you can really take them down to 40 meters. I could be wrong.
I mean, you must be. I mean, despite the fact that there are some controls sort of built into the housing, you must still be fairly limited in how much control you have over your camera in comparison to using touch screen technology and all the rest of it on land. Do you prep your camera before? I mean, how much flexibility do you have when you're underwater?
Okay. The only thing you can't do is if you want to use your lens manually, you can't use the ring to focus. Or you can actually. You can. Sorry, take that out. Um, you're actually not limited much at all, because you have complete access to your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO. You can move the focal point around using buttons on the back of your housing. So there's not really anything that you can't do underwater that you would want to do on land. Underwater, we use autofocus because we're always moving. Using manual focus is very difficult, although some people use back button focus. But yeah, I haven't found that I'm restricted in using the settings that I need to underwater in any way.
I think that, I mean, I can imagine that with sort of advances of especially in autofocus technology over the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years, that must have made a huge difference for underwater photography, especially when you're in an environment where you know there isn't necessarily always a whole lot of light.
Yeah. So underwater, if you're shallow, there is quite a bit of light, and if it's sunny, it's also more light. But when we start going deeper than about 10 meters, our cameras actually struggle to focus. So in order to help our cameras focus, we have what we call focus light. So it's a focus light. It's just a torch. And what it does, it gives you a nice beam of light where you're focusing, so that especially for macro underwater photography, you want to focus on your subject. We put a focus light on. It lights up where we're focusing. It shows our camera contrast, and it helps our camera focus much more quickly. So it is important. We do need to bring light down with us, because the deeper we go, the more light we lose. And as you know, the light rays travel deeper. Some light rays travel deeper than others underwater. So first of all, as you start going deeper and deeper, you lose your reds, then your oranges, then your yellows, then your greens, and then you get down to about 25 meters, and everything is just one color blue. So all those colors that you see in photos underwater, those colors have been brought back by people using what we call strobes. And strobes are underwater flashes that bring back all the light. So when you see colorful photos underwater, those people have been using strobes to highlight and bring out all the colors of what they're taking photos of.
Is there, because in I mean in my in my line of work in portrait photography, we're always discussing the pros and cons and ins and outs of strobes versus constant light. Is that a thing in underwater photography? Are there advantages or disadvantages, or is really strobe the only way to go?
You can definitely use ambient light if you're shallow enough and if there is light. And then, I mean, for example, when I first started taking photos underwater, I didn't want to use a strobe because it was something extra to add to my setup, and it felt also big and bulky. But looking back at it now, it really wasn't at all. But yeah, if you don't use a strobe, then you have to really control the light through your settings. So you have to use a higher ISO to allow your camera sensor to be more sensitive to light, so it absorbs the ambient light from the sun. You have to open up your aperture to let more light in, and you have to slow down your shutter speed. And the problem is if you start slowing down your shutter speed too much, you get a lot of motion blur, unintentional motion blur in your underwater photos. So you have to really understand light, and you have to understand your settings in order just to be able to use no light, just to use the ambient light from the sun. And it can be used to create really beautiful photos underwater, if you're shallow enough to harness that light of the sun. Um, another good reason, or a good example of using ambient light from the sun, is when you're taking photo of a wreck, and you're not going to, even with the biggest, strongest strobes, you're never going to be able to light up a wreck. So then you use the directional light of the sun to create textures on that wreck. So you can have the sun coming from your right or the left to create textures on the wreck. So you can use ambient light. You have to understand your settings to be able to get the right exposure. That's really important, because when we go down deep, there's hardly any light at all. And that is when you do have to bring in strobes. But underwater photography, especially wide-angle underwater photography, you need to balance your strobes with the ambient light as well, so that you're reflecting exactly what you see, rather than, for example, when I first started taking wide-angle photos underwater, I used to love this dark blue background and use my strobes to light up the reef and the fish, because there was so much contrast. But because the water was so dark, people asked me if I was diving at night, when I wasn't. So it's really important with wide-angle underwater photography especially, to bring in that ambient light from the sun so that your watercolor is the right color, and then use your strobes to light up your subject, whether it's a diver or a shark or a reef. So it's understanding light and how to use it underwater as well.
That sounds like exactly the same, the same rules that apply to, let's say, on location lighting. Whenever I teach on location lighting, like when we have a model, for instance, in a particular scenario outdoors, it's all about balancing that natural light with your strobes so that you get sort of a natural look, but you're putting the focus on your subject. But could you use LED lighting underwater, for example? Is that a thing, continuous light, or is it really just strobes?
Some people do use constant light, so they might use wide beam video lights or narrow beam video lights or torches. You can, but I have a saying: if you can't touch it, you can't light it. So the light from those lights doesn't travel that far underwater. So if, for example, you want to light something big, they're not really very effective.
Is that like a major difference? Because that's another thing I was gonna ask you. Mainly around things like diffraction, for example. I mean, are the rules of lighting things underwater slightly different from the way they apply on land?
You're asking the wrong person. I don't know how to take photos on land.
Oh, good point.
So we have what happens underwater is that the light comes from the sun, it lights your subject, it bounces off your subject, and it comes to your camera. So it has to travel far. And then those different colors of light disappear the deeper you go.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, so it does work differently, because our light has to travel further. Well, it has to travel through water, which absorbs the light. So it does work completely differently. That's why we use a lot of artificial light to light our subjects.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. That's actually really interesting. I need to look into that. Now, how difficult is it to, dive with all of that equipment? Is there something you have to do to adjust, like, let's say, things like buoyancy or something? Because I'm just thinking, because I mean, the little experience I have of diving, I remember, buoyancy was always a thing, balancing out your weight against your buoyancy, and in order to, you don't just sink to the bottom like a rock. So I'm always, I'm always fascinated when I see on TV documentaries, for example, when I see underwater film teams, for instance, handling camera rigs. I'm always quite interested in how they get all this stuff to float and to be buoyant underwater. Is that what are the things you have to do in order to ensure that your gear doesn't just sink to the bottom the minute you let go of it?
Well, it probably will do. So basically, it's really heavy. I mean, my camera equipment with my camera and my housing, my strobes, and everything together, it probably weighs about 10. I don't know. I'm not very good. I should have weighed it, but it feels like it weighs about 10 kilograms. So what we do is we have floats. We have floats that we attach to the arms. So we have a housing, then we have arms, and then at the end of our arms are our strobes. So the strobes attached to arms, and we can move them out. We can move them in depending on the type of picture we want to make. So on those arms, we put floats. So the floats give our housings quite a bit more buoyancy, but you don't want your housing to be so light that it's floating up, because then it can actually hurt your wrists when you're trying to hold your camera still. But you also don't want it to be too heavy that it's pulling you down. So yeah, you want it to be slightly neutrally buoyant. But what's more important is that you as a diver have good buoyancy without your camera. Because the first thing I say is, if you can't control your buoyancy underwater without a camera, it's going to be 100 times worse with a camera. So first of all, before you even take a camera underwater, make sure that you can control your buoyancy properly, because otherwise you're going to damage the reef and you're going to hurt yourself. So once you understand how to have good buoyancy underwater and your camera is comfortable, that it's not too heavy, it's not too light, then go and dive and take pictures. Otherwise, you're going to hurt yourself and you're going to hurt the reef. And also, if like me, you dive with a dry suit and you have air in your dry suit and your camera's too heavy, it's going to pull you down and your feet are going to get the air in and you're going to get floaty feet, and that affects your buoyancy too. True story, happened to me before. When my camera was too heavy, it was pulling me down too much and I kept getting floaty feet, and then I couldn't control my buoyancy. So buoyancy is really, really important underwater if you want to hold your camera still.
Is that something you have to sort of train for specifically? Because I'm thinking, I'm just thinking for anybody who might be interested in underwater photography and is thinking, well, I'm just going to go and go to the local dive center and do like a diving course. Is that enough, or is there some special training you have to have in order to do that kind of thing?
You don't, as long as you're good, uh, if your buoyancy is good underwater, that's really the most important thing. There's not really any training to get your buoyancy right underwater with a camera. Obviously, I'll help you if you need it. But I think that's something that you actually have to make sure that your camera's got the right amount of buoyancy, and then just how to control yourself underwater. It's not that complicated if your personal buoyancy is okay.
I mean, it sounds super interesting. Yeah, you run a whole lot of workshops around the world. In fact, you've just come back from a workshop in Indonesia. Is that right? Tell us a little bit about that. What can people expect at a workshop like that? What is it that you teach at a workshop?
Well, what I like to teach in my workshops is, first of all, understanding the foundations of underwater photography, because everybody who has a camera is an underwater photographer, but they don't all know exactly how to use their cameras and their settings. So what I do first of all is I make sure that everybody is on the same level playing field, that they all understand what ISO, aperture, and shutter speed do. And then once we all understand that, then we learn how to use those settings to create the different types of, I normally do macro underwater photography workshops. That's my specialty. Um, so I teach people how to use their cameras, how to set them up, and then how to concentrate on taking macro shots. So the workshops start and they build, every lesson builds on the other. So the first is to make sure that everyone knows how to use their cameras. Then we learn how to use diopters. So diopter is like this magnifying glass that you put on the front of your housing, and it magnifies the creatures that you're taking pictures of. So instead of them looking tiny like that in the screen, they look like that, because a lot of the creatures that we photograph are very small. So it's really important to understand how your diopter works so that you use the right settings to get sharp pictures with your diopter. And then from there on, we build on how to control your light, how to use your strobes, how to light your subjects properly. And then on that, we build on how to use snoots underwater, because it's really important as a macro underwater photographer to be able to separate your subject from its background and to make your subject the star of the show. So you can do that through lighting. If you use a snoot or inward lighting to light your subject so that the background is black, or you use your settings, your aperture, to create a shallow depth of field to separate your subject from a busy background so that only your subject is sharp, but the foreground and the background is blurry to make your subject stand out. And from there on, we learn creative techniques, creative lighting techniques, creative composition. And from there on, we just focus on the skills that we like so that we can create photos that we enjoy making and that we have a portfolio that shows our best work. So it's really an all-encompassing workshop. I actually do this my first workshop. It's an all-encompassing workshop for people who want to really master their macro underwater photography and learn all the essential techniques to make their subjects the star of the show. And then it also includes I include a lot of composition and also one-on-one coaching whilst we're in the water, whilst we're out of the water, to help people really, really hone their skills whilst they're on the workshops. So they're quite intense, but the people come away with having gone from knowing maybe not very much or being frustrated or confused by their settings and their cameras to going home with really, really amazing works of art. It's incredible to see people's journey throughout the workshops.
What's the thing that's fascinated you specifically about the macro aspect of underwater photography? Because whenever I think about underwater photography, in the first instance, I think of I don't know, wrecks and sharks. You know, so big things. What was the thing that got you interested in macro photography underwater specifically?
I kind of fell into macro photography quite naturally here, because in Cape Town we don't always have the best visibility. Normally it's between 5 and 10 meters, and our reefs are very vibrant, and the creatures on our reefs are so fascinating and beautiful, and the colors are amazing. So I spent a lot of time photographing what we call nudibranchs, which are sea slugs, and they come in amazing colors and shapes and sizes, from blue and yellow to pink, or orange and white. And they're just so beautiful and so fascinating. I think just it sounds really weird, but we also have little fish. They're so colorful and they're so quirky. And I just love trying to capture their personalities. So for me, macro underwater photography gives the viewer an insight into the tiny creatures that get overlooked, because there's people always see photos of sharks and wrecks and dolphins and whales and reefs. But the macro life is so fascinating, and it's really beautiful, and it's almost like stamp collecting. We love to go and find different nudibranchs and new nudibranchs and find the best way to photograph them, whether it's shallow depth of field or snooting them. And I think what's so nice about macro is that it reveals the colors and the details and the textures of some of the tiniest critters and creatures in the ocean. And they're just beautiful. So that's the appeal to me for macro underwater photography. I love wide angle photography too, but I just don't get to do it as much as I do get to do macro.
So I tell you, the thing that really fascinates me about macro photography, and I'm saying this from somebody who's, essentially a portrait photographer, but in my sort of spare time, and sometimes some of the work I do for Platypod, for example, I like to dive into macro photography just because it opens up an invisible world that exists around us, almost like a different dimension. That's kind of how I see it. Things that are there all the time, but we just don't perceive them.
It is magical. And, on land, I think it's much easier to do macro photography. And I've seen some amazing work with mushrooms and flowers and insects and incredible lighting with constant LED lighting and a little bit of um, pot scourer behind to create these sort of bokeh balls and bokeh bulbs. We do that underwater too. We'll take pot scourers and we'll put them behind our nudibranchs, and then we'll take like a torch with a purple filter and we'll shine it at the pot scourer, and then with an open aperture you can get that blee bokeh as well, which is a lot of fun. So we do steal some ideas from land macro photographers, but it is fascinating, and I just feel that with macro underwater photography you can create so much more art than you can with big animal and reef photography. I mean, the world is your oyster with macro photography because you can use your settings to create incredible images. You can take a photo of a rhinophore of a nudibranch, which is just this little feeler that comes up, and just a photo of that and hone in on its details and textures. And it's just incredible what you can actually capture with macro photography underwater.
I feel it's like a double whammy, really, because the underwater world is sort of like an alien world already. But when you dive into the sort of macro world of that, is sort of a double alien world almost. It's even more, it's even further removed from what we to perceive in everyday life. So it's even more fascinating. So when you shoot underwater, especially when you're shooting macro, do you shoot fully manual or do you rely on some of the automatic modes on your camera?
Oh no, I completely shoot manual. Obviously, I use autofocus, continuous autofocus, one single point focal point. But I always control my aperture, my shutter speed, my ISO. And the reason for that is cameras auto modes like AV mode, TV mode, or P mode, or any of those other modes are not designed for underwater. So if you, for example, put your camera onto auto ISO, you will lose all contrast in your pictures. Your light will bleed and you won't get sharp edges. If you rely on AV mode or aperture priority mode, your camera will slow down your shutter speed so much that you'll end up with motion blur. If you could put your camera on TV mode for fast moving subjects such as dolphins and sharks, because then you don't have to worry about ISO or the aperture. The camera does that for you, and that's much easier to use. The camera is much more forgiving underwater with TV mode, and it does make it easier. But I prefer manual, especially for macro. I'm a control freak, and I like my camera to do what I want it to do, so I can create the images I want it to do.
And TV mode on the Canon for all those Nikon shooters out there is shutter speed priority on a Nikon, or I think that's what's called. I think that's what's called on a Fuji. I'm not entirely sure. All you Fuji shooters, let me know in the comments. Um, Now, your macro work is always so full of character. How do you what do you do to get them to come across so expressive?
Um, I think what you really have to do is you have to love your subjects and you have to feel an emotion for your subject, some sort of emotion. And if you feel emotion for your subjects and you can create that connection or that can portray that emotion or that love for your subjects with your images, your viewer will see it too. So what I like to do is I like to, especially for fish and octopuses and things like that, I like to watch them. I like to observe them. I like to make them feel comfortable in my company. And when they feel comfortable with you, they'll do two things. They'll either swim away if they don't feel comfortable, or they will stay there and they will be inquisitive, and they also like to see what you're doing. So I like to spend my time with them, make them feel comfortable with me, and then I get a little bit closer, because obviously with macro underwater photography, you want to fill the frame with your subject. So sometimes when I want to take a photo of a fish, I'll swim past and I'll pretend I'm not interested in it. And then I'll swim past again, because they normally just sit on the reef. So I wait for them, I let them sit there and I'll swim past, and then I'll swim past again and I'll get a bit closer, and then I'll stop and watch. And I'll look to see if the fish is interested in me or if it's scared. And if it's interested, sometimes they actually swim straight to you, and they see I think they see their reflection in the port of your camera, and they're quite interested because they think it's another fish. So they swim closer, which helps to take pictures. So then when I get close to them or they get close to me, then I wait for them to look directly at the camera, because it's so important to have eye contact with your subject, because if your subject's not looking at the camera, it's not looking at your viewer. So it's really important to get eye contact with your subject when you're photographing them. So you have to wait for them to be looking at you and have both eyes looking at you, because sometimes they'll have one eye looking this way at you and the other eye looking up away from you. So you have to wait until both eyes are looking at you, and then you have to press the trigger. So it's a lot of patience. It's letting your subject feel comfortable in your presence and having a connection with your subject. And eye contact is what causes that connection. So I think that's what creates that sort of personality and connection and emotion with your subject and in the picture.
You must have sort of an innate interest in, marine life and, and the way those creatures' behavioral patterns. Um, because I always find with any wildlife photographers or pet photographers, for instance, that I've spoken to, um, the more you know about the particular animal or subject that you're photographing, the easier, in a sense, it is to get good shots because you can understand and predict their sort of behavioral patterns. Is that something that's always fascinated you, marine life?
It has, because I think it's really important to understand your subject to be able to photograph them. And underwater, if you know where they live, if you know what they eat, you can also find them more easily. So if you know what their and also if they're nudibranchs, they lay eggs, egg ribbons, and every different type of nudibranch has a different type of egg ribbon. So if you can find the egg ribbons, you can often find the nudibranchs. If you know what they eat, you can go to if you're looking for a particular type of nudibranch, you can go to what their food source is, and you can look for them there. But also, their behavioral patterns. Nudibranchs are either eating, mating, or laying eggs. So if you know where they're eating and where they're laying their eggs, you normally find them. But behavioral patterns are more interesting with fish and octopuses. You get different types of personalities of the same type of fish. So one of my favorite fish is called the speckled clipfish that we find here in False Bay where I live. And they like to sit on the reef and watch you go by. So if you know where they hang out on the reef, they like to sit on the rocks and watch you, then it's quite easy to find them. But it's not like they will swim away and come back to the same place. They'll just swim away. If you know where to find octopuses, they're either under rocks or sometimes they're just sitting out on top of the rocks. So it's really just a case of looking for where they could be and knowing where they can be, rather than a behavioral pattern. Some blennies can hop from one place to another, but for macro underwater photography, it's not so much their behavior, it's more about knowing where they live and what they eat, so that you can find them and capture them that way. Capture them, I mean taking photos, not like
Yeah.
taking them somewhere.
What's the most challenging creature you've photographed?
Oh my gosh. So many. I think it's quite interesting because I love nudibranchs. Here in Cape Town, they don't swim, they move very slowly. So if you see a nudibranch here, it'll just be sitting on a sea fan or a soft coral, and it hardly moves. So you can take quite a few pictures and you can wait for the right moment to take the photo. Whereas when you go to somewhere like Lembe, they move so quickly. You get your settings set up and you look at them and they've turned around and they go in the opposite direction. So then you have to go to the other side of them. And just as you're set up again, they've turned around and they're going in the other direction again. So photographing nudibranchs in Lembe can be challenging. Another subject that's also quite challenging are pygmy seahorses. So those tiny little seahorses that you find on sea fans, they always tend to turn their face away from you. And I'm a strong believer in taking photos in their natural environment, in their natural way. I don't want someone to poke it from behind so that it's pointing at me. So for me, they're very difficult to photograph because they don't like light. So then you have to be very quick when you take photos of them that you're not shining light at them, or you have to turn your focus light off. So pygmy seahorses are very difficult to photograph because you really want to get that iconic shot where they're looking at your camera, but in real life, they hardly ever do look at your camera. They're normally shying away because they're very shy creatures.
Over the time that you spend photographing underwater environments, have you noticed a change happening in there as far as like just the environments are concerned?
I've been taking photos since 2008, and I see changes in the environment. For example, I've seen dive sites where there's been invasive mussels, which come in through the bilge water of ships, and it comes in and there's mussels, invasive black mussels from Mediterranean, so Mediterranean black mussels that come in the bilge water of ships, and they take over a complete reef. So they will cover a reef. What happens then is they grow quite big and then they kill or they take up all the space of the natural marine life there. So the sea fans and the sponges and the hydroids and things that are normally on those rocks get taken over by these invasive black mussels. But what I've seen is the starfish come, and then you find masses of starfish sitting on and eating all the black mussels. And then the black mussels disappear and the starfish disappear, but the reef is then bare. But within about a year, the reef comes back to life again and everything starts growing. So I think, that's kind of a man-made or a man-infused effect that happens on the reefs. But it's very nice to see how nature takes control and fixes it again. So I think it's very interesting to see like things like that happen. Another thing I've noticed is not here, but on a trip in Bali, the water was very, very warm. And when the water's very warm, and I think this is probably, from global warming, you're getting these extremes of extreme temperatures, hot and cold. The water's becoming a lot warmer. And what happens when the water is warm? All the creatures that are normally shallower go down into the depths, and it's harder to find them. But then when the water cools down again, the creatures come back up to the shallows again. That's also for me very interesting.
Um, is there a particular species whose habitat you're particularly passionate about?
Oh, well, I love all nudibranchs, but I do have a favorite, and it's the one that we find here. It's called the gas flame nudibranch, and it looks like a hedgehog, and it's yellow and blue, and it's just so beautiful because yellow and blue together is already a beautiful color combination. And when you photograph it with a black background, if you snoot it so only your subject's lit and nothing else is lit, it really makes them glow. And so the gas flame nudibranch, which is endemic to False Bay or endemic to the southern part of Africa, I should say, is definitely my favorite subject to photograph, because it doesn't matter how many times you photograph, it always looks different, because of the way the light falls. And some species just, I don't know, just glow more than others. So they're very fun to photograph, and they're very, very beautiful, and they're very special to me.
I love the way how passionate you are about, the underwater environment and photographing it. And I'm thinking, I'm starting to realize what a steep learning curve it actually is, moving from land to water, from in a photographic sense. Um, what's sort of the biggest mistake that beginners would make when they, first start taking pictures underwater?
Well, the good thing is we're all beginners. We all start out as beginners, and nobody's better than anyone else. So when I started out, and I see a lot of beginners making the same mistake, and that's not getting close enough to your subject. So the problem is you think you're close enough, but you really need to get close. You need to fill your frame with your subject and make sure that your subject is the star of the show. So that's the biggest mistake I see a lot of beginners making, is just not getting close enough to their subject. And what happens when you're not close enough is that your subject is kind of like small in the picture, and it's not all that easy to see. And also, because you're further away, you're not able to light it properly. And also, because there's more water between your subject and your camera, the water acts as almost like a diffuser or a lens, and it makes the photo less sharp. So it's really important to get as close as you can. When you're taking photos, try to fill your frame with your subject.
Obviously, there's a lot of equipment involved, as we discussed earlier. What is the sort of thing that someone who's trying to get into underwater photography? What is the kind of thing you should prioritize to get started?
I think, some people think that they need to get the most expensive camera and the most expensive housing. I think if you're not sure if you're really going to enjoy underwater photography, the best thing to get is a starter camera and a housing and a strobe and a focus light. So you can get yourself it's the Olympus, but it's now OM TG7, and a housing for that and a strobe. Or you can get yourself a compact like the Canon G7X Mark III, or you can get a Sony RX100 V7.5. I can't remember the latest one, whatever the latest Sony RX100 is. So those are three good starter cameras to start out with. You need a housing to keep your camera dry. And if you really want to have good lighting in your pictures and to make sure that your photos are sharp, you need a strobe. And you don't need to get the most expensive strobe. There's some affordable strobes out on the market. But if you want to start out taking good pictures, those are the essentials that you need.
And the specialist strobes, I assume, rather than sort of a regular strobe in a housing. Is that right?
Yeah, if you use the flash in the housing, what happens is the housing can often block the light from your flash getting really close to your housing. So it's kind of okay if your subject is about 15 to 20 centimeters away from the front of your camera. Then you can just about use the flash inside the housing. But the problem is that where the flash in the housing is positioned, it creates one of our biggest problems that we have in underwater photography, and that's what we call backscatter. And that's when the light from your flash or your strobe lights up the particles or the sediment in the water between your subject and your camera. And those particles reflect the light from your flash back at your camera. And that's what causes what we call backscatter. But because where the camera's flash is situated, it's very easy to get backscatter. It's very, very difficult to avoid backscatter if you use your camera's flash. So if you get a strobe, just one strobe, especially for macro, you can position it in a way where that cone of light, because the light comes out of a strobe in a cone shape. So you want that cone shape, you don't want the light to light the water between your camera and your subject, but you want that cone to light your subject, but not the water between your camera and your subject.
Can you use off-camera flash underwater? Does that work?
Oh, now we're getting into technical underwater photography. Okay. So to fire your strobe, you need to have what we call a fiber optic cable or a sync cord. And what that does is when you take a picture, either the flash on your camera or a flash trigger that connects to your camera fires lights up the fiber optic cable, and then those lights trigger the strobes. You can use sync cords as well, which connect to the hot shoe of your camera, and then that does the same thing. If you want to do off-camera lighting, you still have to be able to fire your strobe somehow. So there's two ways of doing it. You can get it's like a flash trigger that you attach to your strobe. So you move your strobe maybe 2 or 3 meters away, and then that flash trigger picks up the light from your camera's housing, and it fires your strobe. That's the one way. The other way is that Marilux, the company that I'm an ambassador for them and I've got their housing, they've created this thing called the LumiLink. And it connects to the top of your housing and it fires a flash that then triggers your strobe over there. So and they have strobes that have receivers on the side of them that pick up the light from the LumiLink. So when you take the picture, the LumiLink fires the light to your Marilux strobe that picks up that light from the LumiLink and fires your strobe off camera. So it's quite technical. It does need extra special equipment. It is possible, and the results are a lot of fun because then you can put it behind a sea fan, or you can be in a cave and you can light up the stalagmites, and create off-camera lighting like that. So it's very creative. It needs a lot of pre-planning, and it is quite equipment and expensive equipment intense, but the results are amazing.
How do you fix your strobes when you use off-camera lighting? Do you use regular lighting stands, or how do you position your strobes in place?
You can have a tripod. So you can get a tripod that you can weight down and you can put it wherever it needs to be. So you can get little underwater tripods, or you can just prop it up behind something. You can put it on some sand behind a sea fan, or you can make a little pile of rocks and put it on there. So underwater photographers can get very, very inventive if necessary.
What's your next big underwater project, or adventure, I should say? Because these things are always called adventures in a seafaring environment. What's your next
They are on
adventure?
adventures. Yeah, my next dive is my next adventure. Um, well, I've got 2 workshops next year. I've got one in Lembeh again and one in Banker Island. The Lembeh is in May and Banker Island is in June. And there's some lovely soft corals and beautiful reefs in Banker, so it's going to give us the opportunity to do some lovely wide-angle underwater photography. So those are the sort of things that I've got planned. But for me, just diving here in Cape Town, the reefs are so amazing. It's just beautiful. And you never know what you're going to see. So for us underwater photographers, every dive is an adventure because nothing's guaranteed. We don't know what we're going to see. We might go diving and take photos of the reefs and come across a sunfish or a shark or a dolphin or a whale or even a turtle that we don't normally get here. So every dive is an adventure because nothing is guaranteed and you never know what you're going to see. And it's just always fun and exciting.
What's your favorite place in the world to dive and to photograph?
Here at home in Cape Town, False Bay. I live in a village called Gordon's Bay, which is about 35 kilometers from Cape Town Airport. So easy to get to. It's where I started diving. I love it. The corals, the soft corals and the colors are just so vibrant and so beautiful. And we don't have lots and lots of schools of brightly colored fish or schools of fish of silver, but the reefs and the marine life here just make up for that. It's just so beautiful. I love it here. There's always something to photograph, and the reefs are so marine dense and rich of life, and it's so vibrant. Just my favorite place.
What is the most dangerous situation you've ever been in? Because this is the next thing I immediately think like, oh well, underwater photography. You're dealing with sharks, you're dealing with not necessarily, well, I mean, a relatively hostile environment for us humans underwater. Um, what was give us an idea of how dangerous that can get potentially.
Well, I think obviously, the first and the most important thing is safe diving in underwater photography. Always check your air, make sure you've got to check that you haven't been down deep down too long. You have that you have a computer that tells you how long you can stay at the bottom when it's time to go up. So from a diving point of view, I haven't really dived anything dangerous because I've always been very careful about the way I dive. There have been things that have been scary and that have pushed me outside of my comfort zone. For example, there's a dive in Ponta de Ouro in Mozambique, which is very deep, or very deep. It's on the boundaries of recreational diving. The dive goes down to the reef starts at 42 meters. And there's a particular fish there that I really wanted to photograph. And the last time I dived there, quite a few years before that, I got what we call nitrogen narcosis. So what that is, it's almost like feeling a bit drunk underwater. And for me, nitrogen narcosis is my ears start ringing and I get tunnel vision. And I know that something's not 100% right. Some people get weird and behave stupidly and take their regulators out of their mouth and things like that. But for me, that's what happens when I get nitrogen narcosis. I just get sort of ringing in my ears and a bit of tunnel vision. So I was really worried about doing this dive again and getting nitrogen narcosis and not feeling in control. But I really wanted to do this dive because I wanted to photograph this fish. It's called a Rhinopeus frondosa, which is a beautiful purple fish. And I knew that there was one on this reef. And I knew I wanted to do it and I wanted to photograph it, but I was really, really scared. So the night before the dive, I didn't sleep one bit. I was lying in my bed. I was looking up at the mosquito net and counting the holes in the mosquito net and listening to the sea breaking on the rocks. And I should have been feeling really relaxed because everything around me was calm. And I was just so nervous about this dive. But I just told myself, think about the dive, picture the dive in your head. It's going to be fine. So I envisioned the whole dive in my head. Thought about rolling back off the boat, going down slowly in the blue, clear water, all the way down to the reef and swimming and finding this purple fish. So in the morning, I said, right, I'm going to do it. I'm feeling confident. This is going to be perfect. I'm going to find this fish. And the dive turned out exactly as I'd imagined it happening. And we got to the bottom. And we only had 8 minutes at the bottom because it was so deep. We had 8 minutes to find and photograph this fish. And 2 minutes into the dive, we found the fish. And we were all like, yay, cheering that we'd found it. We were so excited. And I got some photos and I was able to write this article for a magazine that I'd hoped I was going to be able to do if I photographed fish. So for me, the thing about underwater photography is being safe, diving safe, never pushing yourself out of your comfort zone in a dangerous way. But at the same time, if you don't push yourself out of your comfort zone, especially as a photographer, you're never going to learn and you're never going to grow. So after that dive, I realized that I can push myself out of my comfort zone if I want to do something, but only obviously if it's in a safe environment and it's within safe diving protocol. But so for me, that was probably the most dangerous, scary thing that I'd ever made myself do. And I'll definitely do it again.
Is there a particular creature that you haven't yet managed to photograph, and that's on your shot list, so to say?
There is, and it's the manatees in Florida. And it's something that I've always wanted to photograph ever since I started my first scuba diving course. Because I was in the dive shop and I was waiting to write my open water exam. and I was really nervous. And I thought, what can I do to sort of like distract myself? And I saw this magazine, and it was a diving magazine. I was paging through this really crumpled magazine, and I got to this page where there was this photo of this amazing animal in this clear, clear water. And it was called a manatee. And I thought, wow, this is so beautiful. And I read about it. It was saying the manatees hug divers, and they love divers, and they're very loving creatures. And I thought, wow, that must be so amazing to go and see this amazing, huge animal in this crystal clear water and be hugged by it. That's so gorgeous. I'd love to do that. Um, so I passed my exam because I wanted to go and see these manatees, but I still haven't been.
Are there any trends in terms of technologies, for example, in the world of underwater photography that you're particularly excited about?
You know, people are always discovering or inventing new things, but it's almost like reinventing the wheel. It's very difficult to invent something new. So what tends to happen is trends come and they go. Um, Things like magic tubes, where people put it like a silver magic tube. It's like a silver pipe in front of their lens, and then you photograph something through the lens, and then it makes like swirly effects.
Oh yeah.
Um, to be honest with you, I can't think of anything that's new and exciting. There are some incredible lenses that are being developed by a company called Nauticam. The ENWL, which is an amazing lens. I would absolutely love to get one of those. It's a lens that it's quite long, but what it does is it allows you to get very close to a small macro subject, but it also enables you to bring in the surroundings. So what it does is it magnifies a nudibranch, for example, and then you still see where the nudibranch is. So maybe if the nudibranch is sitting on a coral, it's almost like wide angle macro, but it's such a great lens because it just the way that it works. That's something that really excites me. I think there's a lot of amazing lenses coming out from Nauticam. Um, they're very, very good at bringing out different and exciting lenses for macro and wide angle underwater photographers. So they're always bringing out new lenses. I've seen some new prototypes that they're working on at the moment, and they're really exciting.
I've always loved sort of super wides, like 14 to 24, that kind of range in the Nikon world. They've on land, obviously, to me, they're great focal lengths to really bring the environment into a shot.
Yes. So what's really nice with my 8 to 15 is that with a dome port, you can get a small dome port. So that's the bit that goes onto the housing to keep your camera dry. So with the wide angle lenses or fisheye lenses, you have a really, really small port, which just basically is just in front of your lens. So what that means is because that lens has such a close working distance, you can basically have that dome port touching your subject. So if you have a nudibranch or a large nudibranch or a smallish frogfish or small frogfish or a seahorse, you can get really close to your subject. So you can fill the frame with that subject, but you also bring into the picture a sense of place where your subject is. And that's one of my other favorite styles of underwater photography is close focus wide angle, or what we call wide angle macro, where you can get that subject and show exactly where it lives. And I think that's also really important because macro photography, as I said, you normally use lighting to separate your subject from a background, or bokeh or shallow depth of field to separate it from your background. But if you can still make your subject the star of the show, but bring in a sense of place of where it lives, I mean, you're really, really doing such a great job and a great service to the underwater world, because then people can see exactly where your subjects are living.
And, in a world where, we're worried about the environmental impacts of what we as humans are doing, I think it's even more important to really, bring that a natural habitat to people's attention. So, you know, maybe it causes more awareness of, how we behave when we treat our resources on our planet.
Yeah, it's really important to show. I mean, as underwater photographers, we do have duty to show the beauty of the ocean so that we can create a love for the ocean in people that don't see it. But it's also really important that we photograph what else is going on in the ocean. Things that are happening that aren't so beautiful, fish that are being caught in nets, and like ghost nets that are hanging over the reefs and things like that, to show, or just things like that that show what man's impact is on the ocean, not just the beautiful side of what's underwater, but also the not so beautiful side. It's horrible to photograph things like that, and I have done it, where I've seen a fish net, a fishing net, just covering a reef, and then there were fish still alive, being well, not suffocated, but dying because they can't get out from this net. And it's not as if it's a net that's catching fish for people to eat. It's a net that's been discarded, and it's on the reef, and it's damaging the reef, and it's also killing the fish that are on the reef. So there's a fine line, between people needing to catch fish for sustenance and to live, and also being aware of the impact of overfishing and damaging the reef with nets and things like that. So as underwater photographers, we really need to show both sides of what's happening underwater.
Now, for anybody who's thinking of getting into underwater photography, what would be like the number one tip that you would give them in order to get started?
Get a camera. Don't buy the most expensive one if you're not sure. Get a basic camera, get a housing, get a strobe, and learn how to use your equipment properly. Contact me because I can help you. But it's really important. People get a camera. It doesn't do what they want it to do. They don't know how to use it. They get frustrated, and they either use their camera to take videos, or they don't use it anymore because they think that they can't. It's a rubbish camera, or that it's just underwater photography isn't meant for them. I mean, I was there too. With my first camera, I didn't know how to use it. I was so frustrated and so disappointed, and thought that it's not for me. And for a year, I took videos because I could not understand how my camera worked. And then one day I decided, no, I'm going to learn how to use this camera. And I got every single book I could find on underwater photography. And I sat at my table and I had a cup of tea, and I made all these notes of aperture, ISO, shutter speed, and what they all did. And then it started understanding how those settings worked. And then I could wait to get in the water and try to do underwater photography with those settings. And my photos started turning out. So I think it's really important to not give up. It's very, very important to understand how your camera works and what settings to use for underwater, because they're completely different to land settings.
Fantastic, Kate. It's been an absolute um, pleasure to have you on the show. It's such an interesting subject. We could talk about underwater photography for hours, really. Thank you so much for being the guest on the Camera Shake podcast this week.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of the Camera Shake podcast. A huge thank you to Kate Jonker for sharing her incredible insights into underwater photography, creative storytelling, and the vital role photography plays in ocean conservation. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and share the episode with your friends. And remember, for bonus content and photography tips straight to your inbox, head over to camerashakepodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter. Until next time, keep shooting, stay creative. See you next Thursday.